Good evening. It is truly a blessing to stand before you tonight. Most of you know the history. The NAACP was founded because of the 1908 race riots that took place right here in Springfield, Illinois. But I have a saying that I've done around the state and around the country. The time is now to stand up and fight. The time is now to do what's right. The time is now in Springfield to take a stand. The time is now for all of us to do what we can. And this is a very historical occasion, so let's give yourselves a hand for coming out tonight. The NAACP is the oldest, the boldest, the most loved, the most hated civil rights organization in the world. But nevertheless, we continue to move forward. People have a myth that the NAACP is about black folks, but I tell you tonight, it's about all folks. People fought, bled, and died for the right for us to be in this room tonight, and let's give those individuals a hand. On behalf of the Springfield branch NAACP, I would like for all of my executive board members to please stand and be recognized at this time. Ladies and gentlemen, Springfield community in the state of Illinois, we are a family. I can't do this alone. We fall on the shoulders of our forefathers, and we ask that you continue to support us when we're out in the community trying to make a difference. The NAACP continues to fight for injustice, justice everywhere, for all people of all colors, all backgrounds, all races. No matter who you are, if you feel that you've been discriminated against, we are here to provide that assistance. And on behalf of the Springfield branch NAACP, I like to say, welcome.
Sing praise.
World Baptist Church is led under Reverend Sean K. Brooks. Let's give Reverend Brooks a hand. And thank you, church family, for your support. It gives me great honor at this time to introduce a great man of the state. I've met him on several occasions, and each time we meet, we extend our hand, but we drop the hands and we give each other a hug. Let's give our governor of Illinois a hug by giving him a round of applause. Governor Pat Quinn.
Well, it is a proper and fitting that we are gathered here on this special day, 50 years to the day of the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In this very room, Abraham Lincoln once served. In this very room, Frederick Douglass came to speak. And in this city, the city of Abraham Lincoln, in the land of Lincoln, our state, I was earlier today at Quinn Chapel in Chicago, a home of the Underground Railroad, and also a place where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came to speak and speak about the need for the Civil Rights Act. Indeed, on August 28th of 1963, he spoke on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in an immortal speech. And right near the end of that speech, there was a woman's voice that was heard. And she said, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." And that person was Mahalia Jackson from our state of Illinois, a great, great gospel singer. And our choir that we just heard, in the traditions of Mahalia Jackson, sang from their heart a very special song, Amazing Grace. But Mahalia Jackson was here in 1970. As they concluded the Illinois Constitutional Convention, they wanted someone special to sing. And so Mahalia Jackson, who was with Dr. King all the way in the battle for civil rights, matter of fact, she said she sang for free all the time for the walking people. And I think it's important tonight that we take a moment of silence, to honor all of those who walked. They may have passed on from this earth. They may have lost their lives in the civil rights struggle, but we owe them a permanent debt of gratitude in America and here in Illinois for their patriotism, for their devotion, for their belief in doing the right thing. And I think right now I'd like to just ask everyone to bow your head and thank God He sent them our way. Thank you. Now, I think it is so important that our state of Illinois in particular come together in this hallowed place, the old state capitol, the place near the Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. President Lincoln is with us here tonight. I think it is most meaningful that our state understands that he's always with us. His spirit is with us. He spoke to, I think, all time, not just his time, but all time, on the importance of ending slavery. And indeed, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to our Constitution of the United States of America were ratified by the state of Illinois in this very room. So it's important that we are gathered here in 2014, 50 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act that took so much effort, so much time and effort to pass an important law. There were men and women from Illinois who helped get that passed. There was a very important U.S. Senator, Everett Dirksen, who was one of the individuals who said it's time to pass the Civil Rights Act and used his influence and his vote to get that passed. We have to acknowledge the importance of President Lyndon Johnson, who signed that important bill into law. But most importantly, it was the movement, the people who caused the legislators to see the right way to go. And I think they were infused with the spirit of democracy, the understanding that democracy, our democracy, is never perfect. We're always trying to perfect our democracy, to improve our democracy. And we have much more work to do in Illinois and in America in the next 50 years. And I don't know if I'll be here 50 years from now. I hope to be 102 because that's when I'll pay off my kids' college loans. But if I can make it to 115, I want to see our state and our country get a whole lot better when it comes to treating people. And I think it's important to remember what Abraham Lincoln said in his second inaugural address. Abraham Lincoln of Springfield, Illinois. He said in that second inaugural, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in. And I think that's what Dr. King would tell us. That's what Mahalia Jackson would tell us. That's what all of us understand. We have to strive on to finish the work we are in. So as governor of Illinois, a state of almost 13 million people, a diverse population, the most diverse in the whole United States, we best reflect our state, the population of our entire country. In the last census, we showed the diversity of America, and we showed it right here in Illinois. So it's important that we send a message to our whole country, and that's why tonight, on behalf of the people of Illinois, I'm issuing a proclamation. I have it here. Please come forward, Teresa. And this is on behalf of our whole people of Illinois. I think it's important that we, the people, acknowledge this day as Civil Rights Act Day. Long may we remember it, and long may it live. Thank you very much for your great work.
Thank you so much. Next, it gives me great pleasure to introduce a personal friend of mine and the NAACP. He has been in the fight for civil rights for a very, very long time. Most of us know him as Jim, but his name is U.S. Attorney James Lewis. Let's give him a hand as he comes forward.
Teresa, thank you. 2 choirs, 2 of my favorite songs. Wonderful remarks from our governor. The president who has given us wisdom and a sense of justice that we try to apply every day, and a speech that's longer than the Gettysburg Address. On July 2nd, 1964, exactly 50 years ago today, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act was an effort, a genuine effort, a tardy effort to set right in the law so much that had gone so terribly wrong and was still going wrong in Southern life, in public life, in American life. I have 4 goals this evening. First, to give Mr. Lincoln, who is listening, a brief update on what this country has been trying to do to fulfill his ideals. Second, to touch on the wide scope of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 so you can see and feel the wide scope of the problems in this country at that time due to the deep roots of segregation. Third, to give you some on-the-ground practical understanding of what this legislation meant from my perspective as a civil rights worker in Mississippi in 1965 and 1966, and as a civil rights lawyer in Mississippi from 1966 through 1973. And fourth, to try to give some perspective on the problems we have today, 50 years after we took action on the problems that we as a people addressed in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Mr. Lincoln, there was a broad Civil Rights Act about 10 years after you died, but the Supreme Court ruled in 1883 that this Civil Rights Act was unconstitutional. And Mr. Lincoln, this country slipped back into a segregated system that gave complete political control, economic control, and social control over all public life to white people. And Mr. Lincoln, this segregated system took away much of the citizenship that was supposed to come to African Americans as a result of your personal effort to pass the 13th Amendment. And Mr. Lincoln, this diminished version of citizenship, this segregated system, went on for generations until this country finally gathered its strength again and started a nonviolent civil rights mass movement to restore full citizenship. And Mr. Lincoln, this country finally began to live up to your promise. And in 1964, Congress passed a new Civil Rights Act. How did this Civil Rights Act even get passed? There had to be a broad-based civil rights movement powerful enough to get the attention of the President, President Kennedy, and the attention of Congress. 2 weeks ago, Clay Risen of the New York Times, author of the book The Bill of the Century, told us as part of this series how the movement got President Kennedy's attention. And then the bill needed the skill and commitment of President Johnson and Senate and House leaders, Democratic and Republican. The greatest legislative obstacle was the 67-vote requirement to bring an end to a Senate filibuster. It took 83 days of debate and filibuster by Southern senators until the Democrats and the Republicans in the Senate finally got 71 votes to end the debate. And the Civil Rights Act finally passed with about 70% approval in the Senate and about 70% approval in the House. Let's understand that this 70% approval was composed of 5% approval in the 11 states that had been the Confederacy and 90% approval in the 39 states that weren't Confederates. And let's understand that this 5% and this 90% were bipartisan. Democrats and Republicans in the South all said no. Democrats and Republicans in the North and West said yes. House and Senate both. The vote on this act was not partisan. Instead, it was regional. What was the scope of the Civil Rights Act? It was broad, wide, and deep. Many things were terribly wrong, and the legislation tried to straighten out many of these. An earlier speaker in this series, Dr. Williams of Fairfield University, listed 6 parts of public life that went wrong due to segregation: voting, employment, public accommodations, education, housing, and injustice in the Southern justice system. And this Civil Rights Act directly addressed 4 of these: voting, employment, public accommodations, education. So Congress came back to voting again, much more effectively in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and finally came to the issue of housing in the Fair Housing Act of 1968. As far as Southern injustice, this got somewhat better along with the other changes. The first part of the Civil Rights Act, Title I, was about voting, but it did not address the real problem. The real problem was that the Southern states had set up a series of high hurdles and difficult legal tests aimed only at African Americans who tried to register and to vote. And Title I of the '64 Civil Rights Act did not knock down these high hurdles, did not eliminate the legal tests. But when this country came back to the issue of racial discrimination in voting in 1965, after the Selma to Montgomery March, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 did knock down those high hurdles, did strike down those difficult tests, and did truly open up the vote as it was supposed to be opened up by the 15th Amendment. I would say that Title I started on the issue of voting, but did not take us where we needed to go. 2 weeks ago, I gave a speech to the County Bar Association on voting rights. If you want more details, get in touch with me. Title II was about desegregating public accommodations, hotels, motels, restaurants, theaters. And this was a serious problem for African Americans across the South. Even after the Civil Rights Act, when I was in an integrated group, I was turned away once at a movie and more than once at a so-called white restaurant. But we really didn't focus on public accommodations because we were too busy fighting to desegregate the vote and to desegregate public education. And going to a so-called white restaurant wasn't that special and wasn't that important. But I do know that in the Deep South, it took some time to open up public accommodations. I returned to Mississippi a lot. My wife and I were there last week, and I will tell you from experience that public accommodations have actually opened up wider and wider and for all. Last week, the mayor of Jackson, an African American, specifically said to us at the meeting that it meant a lot to him and to others that they could go freely to any public accommodation, sit where they wished, meet who they wished. The mayor said, and I quote, "This was no little thing," and this was a big thing. Title III established that government facilities could not discriminate based on race, color, religion, national origin. I will tell you that Mississippi courthouses had signs that segregated the water fountains and the bathrooms by race, and they took those signs down after the Civil Rights Act. I almost walked off one day with one of those signs as a souvenir. I recently read that when they built the Pentagon in segregated Virginia in the early 1940s, they doubled the number of bathrooms in order to have a set of white bathrooms and a set of African American bathrooms. So there really was a history and practice of segregation by government itself, including the federal government. And when Title III said no more governmental segregation, that too was no little thing. It was important and long overdue. Title IV authorized the Department of Justice to sue to desegregate schools, and this was a big help. The NAACP Legal Education Fund sued to desegregate a lot of schools in Mississippi. When I was at Legal Services, we sued to desegregate 30 school districts. The United States Department of Justice came in and sued to desegregate a lot more of the schools. The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare negotiated to desegregate a lot more schools, and it required all of us together in order to get standard school desegregation orders on all the schools by 1970. And this was important work. Title V strengthened the United States Civil Rights Commission. This commission was established in 1957. It held hearings and made policy recommendations. I testified before the Mississippi chapter of the Civil Rights Commission in 1967, advocating policies that would help poor people. The strengthening of the Civil Rights Commission was no little thing. Title VI stated that agencies that received federal funds could not discriminate. Quite simply, agencies were getting federal money and then using the money in a discriminatory manner until Title VI addressed this issue. I can give you the example of discrimination in agricultural support. It became clear that federal and state agricultural programs were being misused to support large white landowners and to shortchange smaller African American farmers, slowly driving African Americans off their land. And this led to a national class action in court against the federal government in an attempt to make up for some of the consequences of discrimination in agricultural funds and agricultural support. I give you this example so that you can see that the scope of racial discrimination, that it reached into how families lived, what they owned, how they supported themselves. It reached into every basic part of daily life. Last week, my wife and I saw a rough cut of a documentary that I hope to get and to show about African American landowners and their crucial role in supporting the civil rights movement. I appear in the documentary, and Title VI was an effort, a tardy effort, to ensure that federal funds that reached the white landowners also reached the African American farmers. Title VII is another important provision, also reaching how people live, how they support themselves, how they support their families. It prohibits employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, gender, religion, and national origin. We did a Title VII case in Bogalusa, Louisiana, in the heart of Klan country, at a large unionized paper mill that had good-paying work for whites and not so good work for African Americans. Title VII required a merger of all the jobs for white workers and the jobs for African American workers into one set of jobs for all workers. And Title VII also required all the adjustments needed to protect African American seniority and other issues, so that the paper mill would have one integrated, effective workforce. We did cases like that. Let me tell you that Title VII and employment issues were politically sensitive. At first, the administration was concerned that Title VII would not get through the filibuster. Then, a Southern congressman allied with a Northern congresswoman to include discrimination on the basis of gender, and the administration thought this might cause more problems, again, with a filibuster. But the strength grew, the act got stronger, and Title I got through, including employment and including gender. And it has turned out to be an effective tool to open up employment for people of color and for women. Title VIII helped the Civil Rights Commission collect voting information. There was a struggle about information about race and voting. The federal government tried to find out what was going on with voting. States and counties tried to keep that information from the federal government. Title VIII meant that the Civil Rights Commission could get voting information. Title IX made it easier to take civil rights cases out of state court into federal court. I can tell you that I have 3 civil rights arrests and a 4th near arrest, and each time we could get the case into federal court for at least a while, and we could slow down Southern injustice. It worked for me, it worked for our clients. Title IX was helpful when we had to defend civil rights advocates against Southern injustice. Title X created the Community Relations Service. This was important then and is still important now. In the 1960s in the South, when it was time for white people and African Americans to try to talk about issues of race and desegregation, to see if there was any common ground at all, it was extremely difficult. The white power structure was determined to maintain segregation now, segregation forever. And the African American community was determined to see an end to segregation in voting, schools, employment, and public life, consistent with American ideals and American principles. It was difficult to communicate across the races in a way that would narrow this difference. But the Community Relations Service did come in and try to establish lines of communication once the white community understood that desegregation was the law of the land. And these lines have strengthened over time. And the Community Relations Service still helps They work with our office on programs to address hate crimes, bullying. They train law enforcement on cross-cultural relations. And any agency that tries to encourage good community relations is always useful until we finally solve all our problems. And of course, we're not close to solving all those problems, not today. And the final title is technical, providing the jury trial if someone is charged with criminal contempt for violating the act. So let me try to summarize what this act meant. It was a public statement by this country that each and every man and each and every woman is entitled to respect in public life. This was a public statement that we should have made in 1619 instead of kidnapping people and bringing them here as property. This was a statement that we should have made in the 1780s when we set forth our ideals and developed our Constitution. This was a statement that we tried to make in the 1860s after the Civil War. And even though the statement in the 1964 was late, it was still a profound statement of who we intended to be as a nation, one nation, with true citizenship, equal citizenship under law. This act addressed so much, just about everything in public life: voting, schools, employment, federal funds, public places, just about everything. Although it addressed just about everything, it still did not address everything, so we had to come back in 1965 and have a Voting Rights Act, and come back in 1968 and have a Fair Housing Act. But the Act of 1964 did start us in the direction of living up to our promises and our ideals. And it was a big step towards ending the racial division that has held this country back. I'm one of those people who believe that we have real problems with education and employment and public life, and that segregation was dividing this country when we really needed to try to move forward together on those issues of education and employment and public life. And I believe that each and every citizen has to have a real chance for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I also believe that citizens have to pull together without division towards these common goals. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 meant a lot, and it means a lot, and it gives us a chance to be that better community and that better nation that we all hope to see. I'm almost done. But I won't be done until I say a few words about today. I believe that we have a new generation of problems of race and class today. For example, the first generation of school issues was simply to open up the doors to all, to desegregate those schools. And we did this. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 helped us to do this. And the second generation of issues was to protect the students in desegregated schools, to make sure that they were not thrown out, make sure they could stay, make sure they could learn. And the third generation, the present generation of school issues, is to make sure that educational challenges and educational opportunities are truly available to all, that we reduce the achievement gap between white students and students of color, that we reduce the achievement gap between middle-income students and low-income students, because the truth is that we need all of our students to succeed. We cannot afford to have students who drop out and get into trouble. We need all our students to succeed. And let me give one more example, and it involves employment opportunity. If we truly opened up employment opportunity in the modern age, with workers truly prepared and educated for the modern age, we would be fulfilling the promise of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, and we would have more citizens able to finance and go out and enjoy public accommodations, and thus fulfill the promise of Title II of the Civil Rights Act. So what I am saying is really very simple. For every issue that was addressed in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Fair Housing Act of 1968, we still have issues of civil rights and voting and housing today. And these problems arise in new and different forms. But if we apply our hearts and minds to today's problems, just as people applied their hearts and minds to the problems of 1964, we can pull together today and address each and every issue in public life today. We can use the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as the model that will help us become the better community today, the better nation today, the better world today, and even tomorrow. Thank you.